Hey guys, this is Salamander Anagram with reaktortutorials.com, and today I'm going to show you how I designed this ensemble in front of us right now, which is a multi-channel effects unit that can be triggered by MIDI. And basically the idea is that we can route up to 8 channels of audio to this ensemble and trigger effects on the fly. Use these buttons at the bottom here to determine which channels are getting affected by which effects, and we have up to 8 sets of controls for each effect. And I made this simple, stupid 2-bar loop in about 3 minutes just to use as an example. Alright, so in making this ensemble, I spent a lot more time worrying about getting the interface right than I did making the actual effects. And the result of that is the effects aren't great, but you can use the interface to control any effect you want, and I'll show you how to do that at the end of the tutorial with one of the effects. But mostly I'm going to be focusing on how to create the interface. But first I want to make sure that our ensemble is set up to accept our 8 stereo inputs. So I'm just going to take our inputs for the instrument and I'm going to keep duplicating them until we have a total of 8 stereo inputs. And then we need to do the same thing for the ensemble view. So again, I'm just going to duplicate the inputs we have until there's a total of 16. And now we can accept up to 8 stereo channels of audio. Unfortunately, there's a bug in Ableton that allows us to only access 4 of these. Hopefully that'll be fixed soon. I'm not sure how it works in other DAWs. Make sure that you set the number of voices in your instrument to 8. Because what we're going to do is we're going to take the 8 left channels and the 8 right channels, and they're all going to have monophonic signals coming in, and we're going to stack them all into one 8-voice polyphonic signal. And this is going to allow us to run all 8 of these channels through the same effect while having different parameters for each channel. So next up, let's create a macro that takes 8 monophonic signals and stacks them all into a single signal. And we can run all of our left channels into one of these macros. And in order to do this, I'm going to use a module called the 2-voice module, which you can find in the auxiliary menu. And what this does is it takes a monophonic input and it creates a polyphonic output where the value of every voice is 0 except for the one voice coming in, and you get to choose which voice that gets sent to. So I'm going to create 8 2-voice modules, again duplicating our existing modules, and run our 8 incoming inputs into the 2-voice modules. And once we're done with this, we can take our 8 polyphonic signals that we've just created here and add them all together. And if we set it so each input is set to a different voice, then we'll end up with all our 8 signals on a single wire. So the second input goes to voice 2, third input goes to voice 3. I think you can probably figure out the rest. So this macro is pretty tedious to make, but fortunately we only need to make it once, and we will be using it a few times, so it's useful to have. And once we have our left channels condensed into a single wire here, I'm going to copy it and do the exact same thing to the right channel. And before we do that, let's just give it a name. I'll call it mono to poly. And once we have the right channel also condensed down to a single wire, then we can start running our audio through some effects. And since our signals are going to be polyphonic, our effects need to be as well. And that means that we can give each voice different parameters for each effect. So let's just create a macro with left and right ins and outs, and call it fx1. And we can start working on building our interface controls. So the main centerpiece of the interface for this ensemble is something I made a few years ago, and I turned it into a tutorial at reaktortutorials.com. I'll give a link to it in the video description. And it's basically how to control a multi-display module with a mouse area. And the tutorial comes with an ensemble download with 4 macros, and we're going to be using the one entitled Fourth. So this just allows us to draw onto a multi-display module using a mouse area, and we'll be modifying it slightly to use for today. First thing I'm going to do is delete everything at the top here that's connected to this event table. Or correction, I want to keep the -1 module here, but delete the event table and the input. And I'm going to use the -1 module here to control the position of a 1-to-m router. It has 8 outputs and takes inputs from the snap value array outputs. So this is basically just giving us all the values that are being drawn onto our multi-display module using the mouse area, and splitting them depending on which values they are, which index they have, and then we can copy the monopoly macro we just made and stack all of the values in our graph into one signal. Next up, we have the step knob that controls the number of steps that are visible in the multi-display, which isn't really necessary because we always want it to be equal to 8. So I'm just going to delete the knob and replace it with a constant value of 8. One more thing I want to do is change the number of values stored in the snap value array down from 64 to 8, because we only need to be storing 8 values. And this is important. You can get some bugs if you don't do that, so make sure you make that change. So the output of this macro is going to be a polyphonic value that we can use to control any parameter of any effect that is also polyphonic. And right now it has a range from 0 to 1, which you can change by editing the mouse area Y range and the multi-display Y range. And finally, since we're working with a bunch of monophonic and polyphonic signals here, we need to be really sure that we're not creating any problems by running monophonic signals into polyphonic modules. So you see these 2 voice modules here are marked with a red X, and that's because we're running a polyphonic signal into them. So we just need to also make sure to set the router here to be monophonic. Alright, so we can use this macro to control any parameter, Next up, I want to create a stacked macro that holds several of these macros, and we can choose which one is visible at any point in time to control several parameters inside the same space. So I'm going to create a stacked macro and a panel index inside it. The panel index is going to be controlled by a list module. So just using bitcrusher as an example, I'm going to have two parameters inside this stacked macro. One that controls the number of bits and another that controls the dry-wet value. And notice that the values coming out of this list are 1 or 2. You can change that by pressing the apply button at the bottom down here, and it'll give us a range that makes more sense for most things in Reaktor. And also make sure that you set your panel index to be always active, otherwise it won't work. So we want two parameters inside our stacked macro. Let's copy the values macro and paste a copy inside. I'll give it an output terminal because we don't really need to do anything else with it. And then we can copy the structure and duplicate it. Oops. And duplicate it. And now we should be able to switch which parameter is being controlled inside the stacked macro. So I'm going to change the parameter values of the first value macro to range from 1 to 8. And that means we're going to set the max and minimum values of the mouse area and the minimum and range values of the multi-display module. Make sure that you get those right in the multi-display module because they are different than they are in the mouse area. Alright, so that macro is controlling the number of bits in our bitcrusher. And the other macro is controlling the dry-wet value. And after doing a little bit of rearranging on the panel, you'll see that we're able to switch between the two interfaces using the list module. So this just gives us a compact way to control all the parameters in effect, no matter how many there are, using a set amount of screen space. And you want to set the width of the stacked macro to around 330 pixels. It should work just fine. And we can switch between our two sets of values using the list module. One thing I don't like about this is that I have no idea what values I'm drawing into this onto this mouse area, and it's pretty easy to record that and display it on the screen. So in order to do so, we're simply going to take the output of each parameter and merge them together, and the most recent one will be the one that is sent to the output, and that's going to be a polyphonic signal, which we can't run into a numeric readout without it causing a problem. So we need to use a voice combiner module, an event voice combiner module in the auxiliary menu. And so this is just going to send the most recent monophonic event to our numeric readout, which I'll rename value. And now we can see which values we're drawing into our array. Alright, so this setup works fine when we want each voice to have its own set of parameters, which oftentimes we will. However, I also want to create a set of controls for when we want each voice to have the same parameters, just to make it easier to program for the user. So I'm going to take the stack macro we just made and shove it inside of a different macro. And this is because we're eventually going to condense it into another stacked macro, as you'll see. But before we do that, I want to create a new macro with some knobs that we can use to control our effect in the event that that's preferable to using the mouse area. So let's create a new macro. And inside I'm just going to have a bit knob and a dry wet knob with the same maximum and minimum values that we've already set in our other macro. So the bits is going to range from 1 to 8 with a step size of 1, and the dry wet knob is going to range from 0 to 1. And we'll create another stacked macro to let the user choose whether they are using the knobs or using the mouse areas, depending on which is more convenient for the effect they're trying to achieve. So to prepare for that, I just want to name all of our outputs on our macros here, and then we can rearrange the panel view. Because once everything's inside a stacked macro, it gets pretty annoying to rearrange it sometimes. Easier just to do so beforehand. So just make sure nothing's stacked on top of anything else here. And once we have everything all set up on the panel, we can place both of these macros inside of a stacked macro and allow the user to choose whether to use the mono controls, so we can set each voice to have the same settings, or the polyphonic controls where there can be different settings for each voice. So let's create the stacked macro, and I'll cut and paste these inside of it one by one just to make sure they are placed in the right order. And we'll need a panel index. And we'll control the panel index with a button, since there are only 2 macros to choose from in this stacked macro. And as always, make sure to set the panel index to be always active. And we can also use the button to control a selector module, a pair of selector modules even, that choose which controls to send to the output. So the first selector will choose which bit control to use, and the second selector will choose which dry-wet controls to use. Alright, so that pretty much finishes up this stacked macro. And the next thing I want to do is to create a macro that responds to an incoming MIDI note and has a set of 8 buttons, and the 8 buttons determine whether or not the effect will be triggered by that incoming MIDI note. So I'm going to place this inside a new macro, and we can name the new macro trigger. And once again, we're going to want to use a copy of the monopoly macro I made here earlier. And we're going to run our 8 buttons into this macro. And this way we'll have all the values of these buttons stored on a single wire. So just duplicate the first one, and then you can duplicate both, then you can duplicate all 4 to make those really quickly. Take a minute to wire them all up, and I want to name them 1 to 8, and that way we can easily identify them on the panel when we want to rearrange them into some sort of a sensible pattern, because of course they're just going to be cluttered all over the place on the panel view. And in order to receive some MIDI input here, I'm going to use the selective gate module, which you can find in the MIDI in menu. And what this does is it allows you to set a single note in the properties here. I'm going to use 48. And whenever that note arrives, it'll send you the velocity of of the note. So I'm just going to compare the velocity to 0, and that way whenever it's on, it's going to be equal to 1. Alright, so then I'm going to use an order module. And what the order module is going to do is it's going to set this current group of controls as being the active controls. We'll use the input to hold the index of this set of controls. We're going to have 8 set of controls for each effect. So the first thing we're going to do is trigger the index on a new incoming gate. And that's going to tell our ensemble to take the controls from this set of macros to use for the effect. And once they're done with that, we can multiply the incoming gate by our polyphonic button signal that we made earlier here. And this is going to be a output that tells our effect which voices to turn on and which to ignore. And so this on signal will eventually end up just controlling a crossfader, and if it's not set to 1, then we're just going to take the input to the effect and send it directly to the output. Alright, so that's just one set of controls here. And like I said, we want to have 8 sets of controls for each effect. So first, let's make an effort to make this make some sort of sense on the panel. And then we can duplicate this macro 8 times and place it inside yet another stacked macro. So this is getting a little convoluted here, but it's kind of what you need to do in Reaktor if you want to get to the good complicated stuff. So once I have these buttons lined up properly, I want to place them directly beneath the mouse area graph that we built earlier, so that the buttons line up with the columns in the graph. So let's set the width of our stacked macro here. When we turn poly on, we can slide the trigger macro underneath the multi-display to align it up with our existing graphics. And I just need to spread these out by a little bit. So I just think this is a really helpful visual indicator of which slider is controlling which audio channels. So together, the trigger macro and the stacked macro containing both the mono and poly control macros make up one set of controls for an effect. And essentially, you can trigger this set of controls to be active using the note selected in the selective gate module in the trigger menu macro. So I'm going to encapsulate this set of controls inside of a single macro that has one input. The single input is the index telling which set of controls this is. Later I'll use that to control a selector module. And so once we have our whole set of controls inside of a single macro made cleanly, we can start building another stacked macro with 8 of these inside of it, and this will allow us to rapidly switch between different sets of controls for each effect in our ensemble. So in order to achieve this, I will copy the macro and paste it 8 times inside of our stacked macro here. And we'll number the position inputs from 0 to 7. And again, these will be used to control the position input of a selector module. So to set that up, I'll just use a merge module from the event processing menu, and we'll give it a total of 8 inputs, one for each position value that we have. The most recent event to arrive will control our selector modules. But first, let's set up our panel index and a way to make it so that we can view any of these macros chosen by the user. So create a panel index and an input terminal. And as always, we want to make sure that the panel index is set to be always active in the properties. And then we'll control this stacked macro with a list with 8 entries. And we can simply name them 1 to 8. Again, make sure that you hit the value generator at the bottom here to set the values from 0 to 7. And we'll want to decrease the width and increase the height somewhat to get us a cleaner look. Not sure exactly what values we'll need. So that'll control our panel index. But I also want to use another method of controlling which macro is visible, and that's using an IC send with our position value to control the list module that we just created. So you can connect those in the Connect tab of Properties. Like so. Next up, I copied this macro here 8 times, and they all have the same selective gate module inside them, so they're all going to be triggered by note 48. So let's go in and change the individual selective gates one by one. I know it's a little slow, but it's the only way to do it that I know of. So I'll set this one to 49, and the next one to 50. And we'll keep counting up to 55. And these will be the individual MIDI notes that we can use to trigger each set of controls for this ensemble. So hopefully one day they'll add like an input to the selective gate module here that will allow you to set which note is active with an event, which would make programming stuff like this a lot easier than having to do it by hand for each individual module. But work with what we've got for now. Let's hop to the panel view and just rearrange the new elements here. We can actually just set the IC send to be invisible. The panel interface for it's not really showing us anything we don't already know, and it's not really offering us any further control of the ensemble, so we can just get rid of it. And it looks like I need to make the panel a little bit, or the list a little bit wider and a little bit taller. I don't want to make it too much of either though. I kind of want to just line it up right alongside the multi-display module we have already. Alright, we also want to turn the label off. And then we can set up our stacked macro to look a little better as well. Got to increase the width obviously, and we'll probably need to increase the height as well to be able to see the buttons at the bottom there. And unfortunately, one thing that we do now is that I've just edited one of these macros in our stacked macro, but the other ones have not been edited yet. And so we can go through and make these changes for all of our stacked macros individually, or we can just make all our changes to one macro and then cut and paste it 7 times. So this was a simple enough change, so I'll just try to make all the changes to the macro individually. And obnoxiously, now we need to change the position of all of the buttons. This is one reason why I just find stacked macros to be really tedious. So like the position of all of our trigger buttons has been moved down now. It's kind of a little tedious to like make these corrections as well. So I'll probably just speed up the tape here for a second so you don't have to watch this all happen. But this is just something to really look out for with stacked macros in general. If there's any visual changes to be made to a macro, you want to make it before you place it inside a stacked macro, otherwise you can just have problems like this compound upon each other. So once we have all that sorted out, we should end up with 8 identical macros here, and we can draw different values onto all of them and reload the values simply by clicking on the appropriate place on the list macro here. And with a little bit of work, we should be able to recall them with MIDI as well. So let's just align this list module with the multi-display and turn the stacked macros frame off. We end up with something that looks like this. This is pretty clean. So now let's make it work. We need to use the output of the merge module here to control a selector module. Make sure you don't use a router here because that won't work properly. And we'll give our selector 8 inputs. And the inputs are going to all come from the on outputs of our 8 control macros. So the set of controls that ends up getting sent to the output is going to be whichever one has been most recently triggered by its MIDI gate, selective gate module that we made earlier. So we'll give an output for this selector as well. And we'll end up sending the value directly to our effect, in this case a bitcrusher. And we can duplicate this selector. And this selector wants to take all of our bit control outputs. And eventually we'll send this to our bitcrusher as well. And finally we're going to want a third selector module for our dry-wet outputs, which I'm sure you could have predicted at this point in time. And once we're done with these, I want to set up our IC send module that we made earlier and make sure that it works. So right now our IC send is receiving values from the range of 0 to 7. But you can see in the range area of our function tab of properties that we have the range set from 0 to 1. So we actually want to change this so that the minimum is 7 and the maximum is 0. Why it's not the other way around, I don't know, but it won't work if you don't do it this way. Seems like it might not be working anyway, and I think the reason is that we have some stuff set to polyphonic that shouldn't be. Make sure we set our IC send to be always active. You'll see our merge module is polyphonic, which won't work with the IC send, and in fact all the values we're sending to it are polyphonic as well. So I just need to go into all the trigger macros here and set the top half of them to be monophonic. This won't affect anything else. Again, this is the sort of thing that hopefully you find before you decide to stack something inside a stack macro 8 times, because it becomes a little frustrating just to have to make all of these tiny changes over and over again to the same macro, especially because you can make a small error in one of them and it's very hard to spot. But I did neglect to do this part, so we're going to have to go through and do them one by one. Then we can set the merge module itself to be mono, and everything should work just fine. We'll be able to recall our different macros by MIDI. It seems to be working just fine now. Cool. Alright, so this set of controls that we have here now is pretty flexible and should be about ready to wire up to an effect. Now it's very easy to modify the macros within here and to create a set of controls for any effect that you want. I'm just going to show you how to wire up the simple bitcrusher that we made recently in a quick tips video. One last thing that I like to do though is this code just looks so filthy, and it really just makes it hard for me to work with stuff when I can't tell where any of these wires are going. So I'm just going to spend a minute cleaning it up a little bit. I'm not going to make you watch it in real time, but just want to give you an idea of what I do with a structure like this so that the code flows a little cleaner and it's just easier to look at and to edit, and it'll also take up less space. Alright, so in my opinion this just looks much better, and it's actually code that I can go back to later on and maybe even edit instead of just being frustrated with how ugly it is. So now we're ready to wire our controls up to an effect. So I'm going to cut this stacked macro out and place it inside our effect macro here. And I've placed a copy of our simple bitcrusher from a recent quick tips video inside this macro as well. We can load the left and right inputs directly into the bitcrusher, and same thing with the outputs. Bitcrusher itself only takes a single input for parameters, the bit parameters, but I'm going to add an on input and make it input number 1, and I'll also add a dry wet input. And I'm going to use the on input to simply trigger an AR envelope that's going to quickly fade us from dry to wet, and then we'll multiply the output of that envelope by our dry wet value. And finally we'll use the product of this multiplication to control a crossfader module. And the crossfader module is going to take both our clean signal and our affected signal and fade between them. So let's give it 2 inputs, or 2 sets of inputs really. And the top 2 inputs are going to be the clean left value and the affected left value. And the bottom 2 are going to be the clean right and the affected right. And that's how we can wire our controls up to a effect. Alright, so that's about it for wiring up the bitcrusher. I'm not going to take the time to show you how to do the filter sweep and the delays that I added as well, but I will include a download so you can check those out if you want. It's pretty much the same process that we just went through with the bitcrusher, only way quicker because we already have most of the work done for us. Once again, this is Salamander Anagram with reaktortutorials.com. Hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial, and if you have any questions or comments, please let me know. And I'll be back with a new tutorial soon.